I am your host today as we discuss understanding and maximizing the value of Microsoft's data loss prevention. There is a lot to get through today. We have a lot of content for you. I'm hopeful to get through all of it. If we don't get through all of it, worry not, we will schedule a second part of this webinar to continue on, as well as if you guys have any questions that we don't address or don't get to today and you'd like to see us cover that in another webinar, we can also do a second part and make this webinar part of a series. Okay, let's dive in and talk about what we're going to review today. So I've got a bit of an agenda there for you. We're going to start today's conversation really focusing on DLP program considerations. We want everybody to understand that DLP is really, it's a journey and it is a program. It's not a one-time thing. It's not a technology implementation. So we're going to discuss that. We're also going to review some of the key decision points for Purview policies. So things you need to kind of figure out before going down the path of developing a policy. And so we'll talk about that a little bit at length. So there's about, those first two agenda items are going to take us probably about 15 to 20 minutes to go over. And then we're going to go into some demos there. Oh, sorry, I'm just going to mute somebody here. We're going to go into some demos and we're going to review in detail sensitive information types, DLP policy creation and tuning. So we're going to try to be as in-depth as we can with this demo. If you have questions, we will try to address them at the end. Please put them in the chat. We do have people moderating that chat. So as those questions come up, if we don't get a chance to answer all those questions at the end, we can certainly, again, either host another webinar or actually just reach out to you directly to answer those questions. Okay, so DLP, the journey from planning to execution. And I really want to focus on the planning piece here. Again, I'm going to reiterate this a couple of times as we discuss this. DLP, data loss prevention, or really any information governance approach or project for an organization is really a program. It's not a journey of a couple of days or a couple of weeks. It's usually months to years. I would argue continuous, particularly as your needs as an organization evolve. And it's important to recognize that. Now, that's not to say you can't do a very quick DLP implementation with Purview, for example, to pilot something and use that to help inform what your program is going to look like overall. But success in a DLP program, and again, or an information governance program, so this is true of information protection, what we call classification or even retention and records management, they are programs. So you do need to take a program approach in order to be successful. So an example approach that you may want to take, and I won't spend too much time on this, but I really want to drive this point home about that DLP program planning process. Those top 4 boxes are really critical for success as you roll out DLP. Again, you can pilot it, and you're going to have some success doing that pilot, absolutely. But if you really want to get the full value of Purview and the full value of your DLP implementation, you need to treat it like a program. So first and foremost, you've got to identify those stakeholders. And the stakeholders with DLP, they're very broad, right? You're going to need folks from HR, you're going to need folks from legal, you're going to need folks from specific business units, from IT. Those stakeholders are key, not just from a development of the program perspective, but also when you start taking a look at maybe some of the policies that you need to create, some of the processes, some of the actions that you're going to take, who understands the data best, things of those nature. We'll talk about that as we kind of get to the end of this box here. The second really important piece is setting up what those program goals are. And if you're running your program in an iterative fashion, right? So it is a multi-year or continuous journey, you're going to revisit these goals over and over. But you do need to identify, certainly at the outset, what are we trying to achieve with DLP? Is it a compliance regime that we need to maintain? Are we trying to prevent, are we trying to meet, say, something like PCI compliance? Do we have privacy regulation that we need to concern ourselves with? Is there an internal HR flow that we want to protect against? The program goals are really key because ultimately your goals are going to drive out what Purview policies you're going to be developing to assist with your DLP. The next critical piece is a program policy. So policy is authority to act, and this is really important when it comes to information governance in general, specifically to DLP, which is usually part of a governance program. If you don't have a policy that sets out the authority to act and maps out what some of the ramifications of violating that policy are, your program is really not going to be an effective program. There'll be a lot of, quite frankly, spinning wheels. So policy is really, really important. And again, generally speaking, you want, I believe in a living policy. You're going to want to revisit that as you take in new scenarios into account that you want to try to protect against or account for. And that policy as well is going to help kind of formulate your program, right? So really confine, if you will, the boundaries of what that program is going to do and what it's not going to do. And it ties obviously very closely with the goals. Last but not least, in this planning process, you really want to categorize and prioritize your data. Now, I'm using the term categorize deliberately rather than classify. Classification is something different, right? Classification would be setting a particular type of information, whether it be sensitive or highly classified or internal use only or public, whatever the case may be. Right? Those are kind of like large buckets. We're talking about classifying your data, or really categorizing your data. We're really talking about putting it into specific categories that are going to influence the actions that you take on it and the scenarios you want to protect against. So, for example, a category might be personal information or financial information or healthcare information. You want to make sure that you're identifying what those categories are. And those categories, or sort of pieces of information rather, may actually have more than one category. Right? A credit card is a really kind of easy example to denote this. You've got a credit card that is both financial information, but it's also personal information, right? And the context of the use of that information is going to dictate what your policies are, because it's the policy you want to apply is going to depend based on that context. So by way of example, it's one I like to use. If you can think of like a city who issues development permits, they might have an address, right? That address would be categorized as business information on like a development permit. And it remains business information until that property is then sold to an individual. Now that address information now becomes private information because it's about a personal information. So the information, its category actually changes over time based on the context and may actually sit in your systems with those two different contexts. The nice thing about Purview, and you'll see this as we go through, is it allows you to set policies that are specific to those contexts, so you can take different actions. Okay, and we'll discuss that a little bit more as we go forward. Once you've got your initial programs sort of set up and you've done that high-level planning process, you want to identify, based off of that prioritization, your policy sets, okay? You're not going to do everything all at once. Now, don't try to boil the ocean. You want to take a slow and iterative approach and start with, I like to call it the low-hanging fruit, the easier things to implement, the things that are well-known and understood, right? Financial information is a really good example of that, where personally identifiable information, not always as easy depending on the context. So, but define what your policy sets are. And for each one of those policy sets, you're going to go through this Purview DL policy development process. And again, this is a recommended approach, certainly not the only one that's there. For each one of these policies, you're going to want to first develop that Purview policy. So you're going to take what we're going to look at in a couple of slides, all the considerations you want to have mapped out before you start to write that policy. Then you want to test that policy, which you can do within the platform, which is very, very handy. Then a limited rollout, ideally to business groups that are ultimately responsible and accountable for that data because they know that data best, right? So you want to make sure that that testing process and that limited rollout, there's going to be a feedback loop where you've got the business now helping you to define and refine your policies, right? Tune those policies, tune your what they refer to as sensitive information types to adequately and accurately detect the data that the business is wanting you to detect. So it's critical within that limited rollout that you have those business users, okay? You're going to go through this iterative tuning process, as I mentioned, right? So it's going to go test, rollout, tune, test, rollout, tune. So that's really an iterative process, right? Once you're down to a point where you think, okay, I've got this policy fairly nailed down, I'm going to roll it out to a larger group, that's when you're at your full production rollout. And you can choose to do that kind of all at once, go group by group if you want to do user-based or go site by site. So there's different rollout approaches you can use, but the idea is once you get to that full production rollout, you're not really done at that point because it's going to require this kind of continuous monitoring, continuous tuning. Again, you're going to account for different scenarios, different context use. You may find that after you've done a full rollout, you're getting a lot of false positives, or maybe you're not getting as many true positives as you expect. So it is this continuous kind of process, and that's just part of this journey. All right. Move on to the next slide here. So a couple of considerations and then pitfalls. Okay, you've heard me say this before. If you've ever heard me speak before, technology is usually the easy part of any security or compliance program. It's the policies and the procedures that are much harder. You want to make sure that you've got those kind of nailed down, right? DLP is not a technology implementation project. Okay, you can certainly have a project to implement parts of Purview, but DLP as a program, or as a thing rather, is a program. You need to treat it as such. And I said this earlier, but I will reiterate it. Corporate policy is absolutely required. You absolutely need authority to act, and you need to know how you're going to govern your DLP program, okay? Understand that Purview is a tool, and it is a very powerful tool, not just for DLP, but for broader information governance, but it is not the program, okay? It is a technology, it is a tool to be used to help you with your program, but it's not the program itself. You need to really focus and understand how your program is going to operate if you're going to be successful. I already covered the technology is the easy piece. Now, if we look at why a lot of DLP programs fail, well, generally speaking, because we haven't answered these questions that you kind of see on the screen. Right? So who are your stakeholders? Have you done a good enough job to understand who they are? That's a really important piece. Understanding how you're going to govern instance. So when these things come up, who's going to respond to them? Who's ultimately going to be accountable? Are you going to have that distributed to multiple different business areas, maybe the business owners of the data itself? Is it going to be privacy? Is it going to be legal? Is it going to be HR? Is it going to be security? That you've got to figure that out. How are you going to manage exceptions, right? Now, Purview's got a really good flow for allowing business users to justify maybe going around DLP policy built into the platform, so it can help to educate your users and educate your DLP program over time, but you're always going to have exceptions. How are you going to manage those exceptions to make sure that you're not getting in the way of business doing what they need to do? Okay. How are you going to manage and tune those policies, right? Are you going to have a group dedicated to it? Is it going to be individual? Are each of your policies going to be maintained and moderated by the business units themselves? How are you going to roll these new policies out, right? We talked about that on the last slide. There's multiple different ways that you can roll out a policy, right? You can kind of go all at once. You can stage it based on area, based on group, based on user, whatever the case may be, but you need to figure that out. You need to answer those questions. And by the way, that rollout may be different depending on the policy. You may have one policy that is kind of universal and you just roll it out all at once, but you might have 3 or 4 other policies that are going to take a different approach. Got to figure out and make sure you've mapped out how you're going to roll out those new policies. And last but not least, and this is a really important one, guys, to highlight, because privacy will come up again and again. You got to identify who is authorized to view that PII. By way of example, right? If you've got your security team responsible for monitoring and responding to DLP incidents, and that's, in many cases, many organizations, that is in fact the case. You have to understand whether or not those security analysts or whoever's in your security team are actually authorized to view that particular piece of information. You'll see a bit of an example of this as we kind of go through when we do the demo. But if you can think of something like an HR or an employee incident report, right? And somebody tries to share that out. And again, this is a demo you're going to see. That information is potentially viewable by those who are responding to the incident itself. So is your security team, if that is who is responsible for responding to DLP alerts, are they authorized to read documents about internal employees, right? That's a question you're going to have to answer. Now, there's controls you can put in place within Purview to prevent that sort of thing from happening. But if you don't define it and understand who's authorized to access all sorts of information, but PII is typically a big one, you're going to run into some challenges. So you got to kind of figure that stuff out. Okay. Let's assume we've gone through the program planning, okay, and we've got our Purview sets, and now we're getting ready to build out policies. What you see on the screen here, and I know it's a lot, but these are the things that you need to ask yourself and define before you start building policies, Okay, first and foremost, what is the data that we're looking for, right? And in the Purview context, that would be, well, what sensitive information types am I going to use? Do I need to create my own? Are there readily out of the box ones, patterns, if you will, that I can just go ahead and use? Do I want to use the standard ones that are out of box? Do I want to use what's referred to as a fingerprint, or even maybe one that's a trainable classifier, right? So these are decisions you need to make. What kind of corroborating evidence do I want? Right, so let's use the example of a credit card, and you'll see this in the demo. The credit card number, is that enough, or do I need to see other evidence in a document before I start flagging incidents? Right, these are important things you need to ask. You also need to take a look at locations, right? Are we going to focus our policy just on Office 365 locations? Do we care more about the endpoint, or maybe both? Do we want to focus on non-Microsoft SaaS that we happen to use, or am I looking at on-premise repositories and variations thereof, right? You also need to start taking a look at your scenarios. What I referred to previously as context, right? What are we trying to protect against? Are we trying to identify internal sharing, external sharing? Are we trying to prevent use by certain apps or certain devices? Are we trying to prevent certain types of things from happening? Do we care about what's referred to as service domains? So maybe it's things like, preventing somebody from uploading a whole bunch of stuff to Box or to Gmail, whatever the case is, right? So you got to identify what those scenarios are. And again, because the context of the information can change, and thus the policy can change, really understanding how the combination of scenario with the actual data itself combined with locations is what needs to go into a policy to cover one or two different contexts, okay? You also need to take a look at scope, right? Who are we going to apply this policy to, or what are we going to apply this policy to? Does this policy apply to everybody or just specific users or groups? Do we want to apply it just to specific teams and SharePoint sites or specific SaaS instances? Or are we really only looking internally, maybe at like file shares, for example? So these are the things that we need to consider. We also need to know what actions we want to take for the policy, right? Is this an audit-only policy? So maybe we don't care whether or not this information flows anywhere, but we want to know when people print this specific type of information because we have some sort of compliance regime. Or do we want to block that from happening or encrypt that data? Do we want to restrict activities like copy, paste, or download to USB, right? Do we want to allow the business users who know the data the best the ability to override a DLP policy? And if so, do we want them to provide a justification and thereby help us to improve that policy over time? And lastly, notifications. Who do we want to notify? Right? Do we want to notify users, and do we want to do that in advance, right, through policy tips, or sort of after the fact? Or do we want to tell them at all? Do we want this to be more of a silent auditing policy? We don't want to let them know at all. We're just trying to collect that information, right? And who are we going to report incidents to? I talked about that a little bit earlier, right? Is it going to be your security team? Is it going to be legal? Is it going to be your privacy team? Is it going to be a combination thereof? And will it be different based off of the context of that particular policy? And last but not least, do we want to collect evidence as a result of a DLP policy being violated? So for example, if you're sharing something externally and you want to allow that to happen, allow the business justification, but then keep a copy of that document in its original format so that you've got the evidence to now just kind of go through and take a look. You can use that document maybe to improve your policy or maybe to take some sort of HR action. Before you get into the developing of the policies themselves, you want to map this stuff out, okay? It doesn't mean you have to. You can go ahead and just, no, we're just going to spin it up and try some things in a pilot. Absolutely. But if you want to be successful, you want to know as much of this in advance as possible. Now, what I will tell you guys is if you take this, you can just put what you see on the screen here and you put it into a spreadsheet, for example, for each policy, and you fill these out before you actually go and build the policy. You may not have all the answers, but it's going to improve the speed at which you develop those policies and the success those policies have when you put them into production. And it's going to make that feedback loop a little bit better. And each time you go through and do a new policy, there's questions maybe that you didn't think about before that now you're going to be able to answer, right? And maybe you weren't thinking about locations, for example, and I only wanted to focus on endpoints, but I completely forgot we got a whole bunch of on-premise repositories that need to come into scope. I need to now identify this for this next policy. Okay, so it's very helpful there, guys. Okay, let's switch over into Purview itself. So now we're going to get into the meat of the actual policies themselves. So let me just kind of switch over here. Now, when you first go through doing DLPs, your DLP policy, if you go back to that previous slide where you said, like, understand what data are we trying to, or do we care about? And either are we trying to prevent or trying to audit? Okay, and there's multiple different ways that Purview can detect information that may be sensitive or it's just that you care about in a document. Okay, I'll briefly review some of them here, and then we'll go in and we'll create a couple. Well, actually, we won't create. What I'm going to do is I'm going to edit existing sensitive information types so that you can kind of see the process that you go through when creating them. I'm not going to create them because it does take time for those sensitive information types to percolate through the system. It can take up to 2 hours, just like policies. So we'll walk through the process, but we'll use the existing ones that have been previously created. But you'll be able to see and understand what that process looks like. So first and foremost, I do want to talk about trainable classifiers very quickly. Trainable classifiers is a big thing. Okay, it's basically a way of teaching the system based off of your information what to look for, right? By taking like an existing document. So you can see on the screen there some of the ones that they've got. I'll just kind of call out business plan as an example. So if you've got, say, a whole bunch of different business plans that you have put together and that represents sensitive information to you, you can build a sensitive information type, create your own, and you can upload copies of what they consider true positives, so actual legitimate good quality data that represent business plans for your organization, right? And the minimum is 50. They recommend up to 200. More is always better. And that's going to help teach the system what is a true positive, okay? And then through that process, you also now need to collect a varying degree of good data and bad data to feed the system, to train the system in order to identify what to look for, okay? It's a complicated process. Okay, we don't have time to go through it today. It would take an hour or two to walk through that process in depthly. Now, there's a lot of out of box sensitive or trainable classifiers that you can leverage. Just going ahead and using them is not going to be enough. You do need to tune them, and that tuning is going to be by providing your own information. So if you see like an agreement or like a financial report or a credit report, as you see on the screen there, you're going to need to feed it examples of your legitimate information in order to train the system. It's a very powerful tool, not one we're going to touch on in depth today, but it's certainly available there for you. The other one I want to touch on a little bit before we get into the sensitive information types themselves, the two that we're going to look at and go through and kind of configure, is EDM classifiers. EDM stands for exact data match. So a good example of where you might want to use this would be maybe you're an organization that has a whole host of product names, and those product names are intellectual property. Okay, you can maintain those in a database, and your policies can then reference that database of values and do exact matches on the names. So way less false positives because you're actually pulling them directly from basically from a repository, and you're doing an exact match on the string there, right, on the word, whatever the case may be. But you need to have that as maintained as a database. And again, we're not going to get into that today in terms of configuring those, but it's certainly available to you. And there are organizations that are in particular fields that are going to use that probably a lot more heavily. The two that we're going to focus on today, though, are a standard sensitive information type where you're creating a pattern or leveraging a function or you're leveraging keywords, and a fingerprint sensitive information type. I'm going to talk about the fingerprint sensitive information type first. So let me just quickly pull up the one that we've created specifically for this. Okay. There we are. Okay. So let's talk about what a a fingerprint sensitive information type is and where you might want to use it. The fingerprinting component of this sensitive information type basically is really good for common standardized forms that you may have within your organization. And an example might be a record of employment or a freedom of information request or an employee vacation request if you have that in a type of form, right? So it's basically a standardized form that you can leverage or that you do leverage, that Purview can now learn to recognize. And it's going to, and you do this through the process, and you'll see this in a second, where you upload an example of what that template looks like. And what Purview will do is it'll now fingerprint based off of all the data that's currently in that form, so that when somebody goes and fills out that form, and you'll see this again as in an example we'll show you in just a second, that it's going to catch that and be able to identify that as a particular type of form, a particular type of information. In this case, what you see on the screen is an employee instant. So just to give you a sense of what this looks like, let me just quickly bring up, hang on just one sec, guys. Bring this up to the side so I can pull this example up, just so you can see what this particular type of template might look like. And it is just an example, guys, just so that you're aware, but I do find it a pretty decent example in my experience. So I'm just going to pull up, here we are. Okay. Sorry, I'm just doing it on the other screen here so I can bring it up. So here's an example of what a form might look like. So this is one I created for this webinar. It's just a very simple employee disciplinary incident report. Okay. You notice it's just a template, right? It's a form basically that somebody can fill out. Okay, and this is what's going to get fingerprinted. So everything that you see on the screen here is what it's going to detect: the table, the strings, all of that stuff is going to be fingerprinted. What's happening in the background is quite complicated. It's actually creating a bit of a hash of this. We won't get into those technical details. Okay, but this is what you're effectively doing. I've got this standardized form. It's the same every time. The only thing that changes is the information that go in the various table fields. Okay. So when you go and you create this type of form, I'm just going to go into the edit here. It's actually a relatively simple process, right? You're going to give it a name, give it a description. All you have to do is actually upload the file. Okay, you come in, you simply upload that file. In this case, that would be that employee incident report. So that's the form. Okay. Go ahead and upload it. And you can also change various things in its confidence level. Okay, so that confidence level is how Purview feels it did in terms of detecting what is in the document, right? So a high 80 above, you can get to exact match, low 30 above, you can change these. Now, what this does is if you've got a form that's a really, that has a lot of really open text fields, right? So for example, if we go back to that form, there was like the incident description, and people were just allowed to type, pages and pages and pages of data. That's going to affect the confidence level there, but you still might want to catch that. Now, generally speaking, you want these forms locked down. You want them limited to how many characters they can enter in fields, so like a true form. Okay, but that's why you can adjust these confidence levels, and you can use these confidence levels in your policies when you go and you create those policies. Okay, so you can have take different actions based off of a particular detection, based off of a confidence level. You'll see that a little bit as we go through. Okay. After you've uploaded that document, that's pretty much all it, and now you can go ahead and you can save it. Now, I'm not going to click save here because, again, it takes time for these sensitive information types to filter their way through the system, and hopefully I don't want to be breaking anything that we've got for the demos coming up. And I was monkeying around with this a bit this morning, so hopefully I haven't already taken us kind of off that path. Okay, so once you've done that, before you actually can use this in a policy, I mean, you can just go ahead and use it if you wanted to, but you can also test it, okay? So I'm just going to bring up another example document here, okay, of a form that's filled out. In this case, it's just a bunch of gobbledygook that's in there, right? Nothing really to write home about here, but it's where we filled out this form. Okay, and so I want to use this document to test my sensitive information type to make sure that it's appropriately accounting for and fingerprinting the document template that I've used. So I'm just going to go ahead and click this test button. I'm going to upload this test disciplinary document that I've created. Okay, and I'm just going to click test. Now, when it comes back, it's going to tell you your confidence matches, which is really handy here. Okay, it's going to tell you whether it's a high confidence, low confidence, medium confidence. So you're going to know how well that sensitive information type is detecting what you want it to detect. Okay, so for example, if I only saw maybe a low confidence, like a low unique match, I might want to tune that template a little bit. Maybe I want to lock down the form fields a little bit by way of example. Okay, or maybe it's not really truly a standardized form, and I need to go back to the drawing board and identify is fingerprinting really appropriate here. Versus if I see high, it's a pretty good indication my testing is good. Now, this is not foolproof. It doesn't mean you're going to put this into a policy and you're not going to get false positives, and you're not going to get false negatives, but it allows you to test before you even put it into a policy, which is really, really handy. Okay. So that is specifically the fingerprint sensitive information type. Now, most sensitive information types that you are going to use, okay, that you're going to create anyways, if they're not out of the out of box, you're going to use patterns, okay, regular expressions, keywords, and whatnot. So I'm just going to quickly click on this custom one that we've created. And this custom one, by the way, is going to come back around when we start talking about tuning, particularly when we start talking about tuning existing or out of box sensitive information types, okay? But let's just focus on this for now in terms of how we would go about creating that. Same kind of process. You're going to give it a name, give it a description. What you need to take a look at now is your patterns. Okay. And you can have different, for any sensitive information type you create, you can use different patterns and different what we refer to as corroborating evidence. Use those combinations and detections will each have a different confidence level. So high, medium, low. Here you're just seeing high and low. So each one of these can have a different pattern, okay, in terms of what they detect. Okay. Now I'm just going to quickly go in here. We're going to take a look at the high confidence pattern. We're just going to talk a little bit about what's there. So the first thing that you need to identify is what they refer to as the primary element. What is it we're trying to detect? Okay. Often that's going to be a regular expression. In this instance, you can see it's actually a function that comes out of box to detect credit card. It can be a keyword list. If I actually click on, oops, I won't do that here. It could be just a list of keywords. It can be a project name, whatever the case may be. You can you can basically define whatever you want as that kind of primary element. The most common that we see is actually just regular expressions. If you're creating your own, right? So you may have like an employee number, and maybe it's got a couple of characters before, or a couple of like letters before the actual employee number itself, for example. So that's a pattern that you would write in regular expression. But there are out-of-box functions, and sometimes you just want to use keywords. And it could be a listing of keywords. Okay, so that's what the primary element is. Now, important to improve detection is what we refer to as corroborating evidence. Okay, so the other supporting elements within a document that are going to heighten the detection level, right, and reduce the chances of false positives. So, for example, you can see in this case here, we've got supporting elements. In this instance, we've got CCC verification, keyword name, and then another function on expiry date. Okay. If I just click into this one, for example, this is looking specifically for other words that are in the document. Okay. In this case insensitive, but you can have case sensitive as well. So it's a listing of words that may also appear in this document that are going to heighten or raise the likelihood that we are actually detecting, in this case, a credit card number. But in addition, you can adjust the proximity. So where in the document these particular supporting corroborating evidence are going to appear. In this instance here, we'll talk about this when we get into the tuning piece. I've reduced this just down to 5. The standard for this pattern, by the way, is typically about 3. That's the default 300 characters. Okay, I've set it to 5. This allows you to ensure that, you know what, if I've got this long document and I've got this weird pattern that looks like a credit card, and I just happen to say the word Visa, for example, somewhere in the document, that's not really enough. Because we know that maybe in our organization, we always have in our documents, we always say the word Visa or CCC within the first 5 or 6 characters of the actual pattern that we're looking for, in this case, again, credit card. Okay, so it's a way of ensuring and improving your detection of a particular type of data. Okay, you can also, if you wanted to, do additional checks, right? You can include specific values. Prefixes is quite handy, right? If you wanted to prefix, particularly if you've got like a specific, you're looking for employee number, you've got a specific pattern that always prefixes. So, in my case, I'm from CDW. Maybe my ID starts with CDW and then the employee ID. So you'd be able to recognize those prefixes. You can also exclude them as well, right, to improve your detection. So this process, and we'll talk about this again as we get into tuning, of developing patterns. And this is why you need to kind of understand really what is it that we're looking for, right? What's the data that we're looking for? But more importantly, or as importantly, I guess, what's the corroborating evidence that we're looking for? What's the supporting evidence so that we can reduce false positives? Okay. And again, you can have multiple patterns where you set the different confidence levels as you kind of go through. The next piece is important as well. So what this confidence is what to show folks who are writing policies how they should use this particular pattern. Right? Use this pattern for high confidence versus low confidence, because confidence level also will appear in the policies themselves. Okay, so it's a really good thing to be able to provide that guidance for anything that you've custom created there. I think somebody is off. Renee, if you could just mute whoever is currently unmuted, that would be great. Okay. So that's how we create the classifiers. And again, there's a lot of out-of-box classifiers that you can use. And in fact, in most cases, particularly if you're just starting on your journey, you're going to use ones that are out-of-box. Oh, I typed that wrong. Right? So you're going to use the default credit card number. It's a well-tested pattern. It's had a lot of success. Microsoft's done a lot of work in validating that pattern. There's a whole host of different types of patterns that are available out of box. I think at last check, if I'm not mistaken, it was well over 270 now. The number 270 is what's sticking in my mind, but I think it's actually over 300 now. And that will continue to grow over time, which is really handy. But you're always going to run into situations where you're going to need to create your own. Okay, so let's take a look at policies. Now, what we're going to do here is just going to be a little bit different, because now we're going to be combining the sensitive information types that we just created into a couple of policies. And then we're going to show you what that looks like from an impact on the user, okay, in terms of how certain actions maybe will be blocked or added or audited or whatever the case may be, okay? First, we're going to take a look at this employee incident form policy. So we've created a policy specifically for this fingerprint sensitive information type. I'm just going to go ahead and edit the policy here, okay? Same kind of process when you're creating it. You're going to give it a name. You're going to give it a description. You should be descriptive. I'm not going to talk about administrative units, but it's a way of scoping down your policy, okay? We talked about before, when you saw on that screen in the presentation, you want to identify your locations, right? What are we actually wanting to detect here? Now, the reason I started with the fingerprinting is I want to make sure everybody's aware of fingerprinting. It's really handy, but currently only supported with the Exchange workload. Okay, not currently supported with any other workload. Now, that'll likely change. Usually when new features come out, they start in one particular area and then they broaden. But as it sits right now, those types of forms or those types of sensitive information types that are usually forms, like they're fingerprinted, it only is supported on the Exchange workload. So we'll go over the other ones when we actually do the second policy, so you can see what that looks like. Okay. Now, within the policy, you're going to create the role, and I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to edit this role so you can kind of see what it looks like. Right. You're going to give it a name and description. Okay. And you're going to choose the content. Right. The sensitive information types. Now, it's not, by the way, limited to sensitive information types. If you've already done information classification using sensitivity labels, your policies can use those to detect as well. So maybe you don't know. Or you haven't been able to find a pattern that works really well, but all of your files on this particular SharePoint are earmarked as confidential and you've labeled them as such, you can include those here as well, okay? You can also add additional conditions, okay? Go down to the conditions, right? To help, and what the conditions are is who or what the policy applies to. So under what condition is this policy going to start to fire? Okay, and either do things like block or control or whatever the case may be. Okay, those are what your conditions are. Right here, we just have two within this policy. We're basically saying, hey, if it is this particular sensitive information type and it's being shared with people outside my organization, so that's the conditions, who and what the policy applies to. Okay, the next piece is the actions that we're going to take. Now, what you're going to see here is relatively simple. This will get a lot more complex when we take a look at the other policy and we start bringing in things like devices. Okay, right now we're just focused on the Exchange workload. And in this instance, what we're saying is we want to block users. Okay, but we don't want to block everybody. We just want to block people outside of our organization. Right. So basically, if somebody tries to share this, stop it. Don't allow it to go through because it's highly sensitive externally. And again, you can play with this, and maybe you've got a different policy for inside versus outside, and that is entirely possible, right? And you need to take different actions accordingly. Okay. The next area we want to look at is user notifications. So do we want to notify the users? We talked about that earlier. And if we do, what is that going to look like? Do I want to change what the email response is going to look like, right? Do I want to change who it's coming from? Do I want to change what that notification looks like to our users if they are emailed back, assuming that they have been able to override this particular action, okay? But we can also show them policy tips as well. Okay, so what's really helpful to users is that when they're in the midst of doing something, sometimes they may not realize that what they're doing goes against the rules, or maybe they know the rules but didn't realize that this particular type of information that they're getting ready to share is actually covered by that rule. So the policy tip basically lets them know before they take an action, hey, hang on a second, just so you're aware, this is a sensitive piece of information and we don't want this shared. Okay. You can also allow overrides. Okay, this is where a user can override the block, if you would. And if you do allow overrides, you could choose to provide justification. So you can say, look, all right, you know your data best, Mr. User, because you're the business. So go ahead and override this policy. But when you do, give us a justification. Make sure we understand why you're doing what it is you're doing. Okay. Then when it comes to the incident reports, right, who are we going to notify that this has happened? So we've already notified the user with maybe a policy tip, but we can also notify them with an email that says, hey, you shouldn't really be doing this. But who else do we want to notify? Do we want to notify our security team? Do we want to notify HR? So on and so forth. Okay. Last but not least, the thing I'm going to talk about is the priority. So the way DLP policies work is you can choose its priority, so what's going to be processed first. But just because one policy triggers doesn't mean the other policies are invalid. So you can choose to stop processing if you get a hit on this policy, or you can let it continue and apply a different policy or 2 or 3 policies. Okay, and usually the way it works is the policy that's got the most stringent restrictions is going to apply, and it's kind of compounded. Okay, generally speaking, you want to just continue processing those policies unless you know, look, if we get this particular policy and it's our number one policy and we're just going to outright block, well, then there's no point in doing that processing. You can go ahead and you can stop that processing. But generally speaking, what you want to do is just continue that process. And again, it is general. It's going to be different each and every time. Okay. Okay, again, not going to click save. So now we've got the policy. Policy's taking that pattern that we had before. We've chosen a couple of action or scenarios that we want to detect, and the actions that we want to prevent, and then of course the notification piece. So the next piece is to actually decide, what do we want to do with this policy? Do we want to leave it off? Do we want to turn it in a test mode and allow us to review alerts, but not actually notify anybody, not actually block anything? You can also show the policy tips, or do we just want to turn it on? Now I'm going to leave this turned on because if I don't, we're going to go back and it may not work because, again, up to 2 hours for these policies to take effect. Okay, so I'm just going to very quickly pivot into my demo environment here. Okay, now I have this document here. I'm just going to quickly bring it up just so you can see what it looks like. So this is the Bob Ross incident form. So now populated with real information. Okay, so that you can see what it looks like there. And what you'll notice is on the exchange where I've created this email, I'm sending it to an external location. Now this says cdw.ca, but just so everybody is aware, my user ID that I'm signed on is actually within our test lab. See if I can find that there, right? So this is my actual email address. This is my actual domain. So my system is seeing CDW as an external domain, okay? And what you'll notice here is immediately once that attachment was uploaded to Exchange by proxy of attaching it to the email here, you can see I've got this policy tip that's appeared up, right? Telling me, hey, hang on a second, this incident form, we're not allowed to share that to external parties, right? So either remove the attachment, change who the recipient is, right? And maybe go and read some more about our policies. Okay. And again, all that stuff is configurable that you saw before. This is a very simple kind of configuration, although in my opinion, simple is always best. Now, again, let's assume that the user decides, I don't care about this policy tip, or maybe they've missed it. So we're just going to go ahead and click send. Okay. Instantly blocked. Now, in this instance, I didn't allow an override, right? I just straight up blocked, right? Because I don't want this going outside the organization. And it's telling you that same kind of message. This action has been blocked, okay? I removed that attachment, though. No problems. Goes through. Okay, DLP in action. I have now blocked something again. Now this is a fingerprint. It's a fingerprint sensitive information type, but I've straight up blocked it. Again, this one only works for Exchange. Okay, so let me pivot back and let's take a look at another policy, one that's a little bit more complex. Now, before I get into this, I do want to review some of the data loss prevention settings, specifically that are going to affect the endpoint, okay? Because there's some very cool stuff you can do here, guys. Now, there's a lot on the screen, not enough to go through, okay? But what I do want to show you specifically is the browser and domain restrictions. What this does is it prevents users from using unapproved browsers to access or share information. Okay. Now, one of the caveats I'll put here, if you've got you see Firefox and Chrome are there. If you've got the Purview extension installed within Chrome or Firefox, it effectively turns it into the same as Edge, and you can start to allow things like overrides and justifications and whatnot, which you can't do with Firefox and Chrome just as they are. So I've got a list of browsers. All these browsers are basically prevented, and you can just add more. It's based off of executable. Okay. And then you've got service domains. Now, there's 2 options that you have here. 1, you can do a block, or 2, you can do allow. If this is set to block, it means anything in this list is explicitly blocked and everything else is implicitly allowed. Okay. The converse to that is setting it to allow, which then means only these service domains are allowed, and any upload or sharing to any other service domain is explicitly blocked. Okay, this takes some playing around with, guys, just so you know, right? Because you can wind up blocking yourself from your own needed services. But I'm always a big fan, being the security guy I am, explicit allow and implicit deny. So deny by default. Okay. Now, what we're going to see when we go and create this or review this policy is based off of different things. I'm going to stop certain actions, and then we're going to see what this looks like from the user's perspective for this particular policy. Okay. Now, there's a whole bunch of other stuff here. Yeah, again, guys, we don't have time to go through it today. If it is something you want us to go deeper into at some point, let us know. You can let us know in the chat here or provide comments back to us in any way, and we can host another webinar where we can go deep into these settings. Okay. I'm just going to back up here, back to the policies. And I'm going to search for that specific policy that we were talking about. Actually, just right there, which is fantastic. Okay, so let's take a look at this policy. Okay. Just give it a second to load there. I'm not going to go over the name, description, or administrative units again. Now, in this particular case, I am covering off a whole bunch more, but what I'm really going to focus on here, guys, is the devices in some of those settings, because a lot of your DLP is really going to be device-based, particularly when your devices are no longer inside your network, right? They're roaming free. You want to be able to control as much as you can. So device-based DLP is kind of really critical. It doesn't mean these other things aren't critical, and that's why they're there. But I want to focus a little bit more on the devices just so you can kind of see what happens there, okay? So when we get into the advanced DLP rule creation, right? Again, you can see a high and a low. I'm going to focus just on one in the interest of time, but I've basically copied the exact same settings for the high confidence as well. Okay. And again, if we get time, it doesn't look like we're going to get time to get into tuning, so we will have to do another webinar to specifically talk about how we do with the tuning. But one of the ways you do the tuning is with this instance count here. Instance count, sorry. So in this case, we've got credit card number and bank card number. Credit card number set to a high confidence, so it's going to flag if a high confidence detection has been done, or a medium confidence detection with a bank account number. And then we've got an instance count, right? 1 to 9. Because if it goes above that, and if you look at the high, the high pattern there that's right after this, you'll notice it actually goes from 10 to any, right? So it's a way of kind of denoting, if you would, different priority or severity levels. Right now, I've got this set to low, and if it was high, it means a lot of information was trying to leave the organization. We've now set that to high. Okay. So let's take a look at the action scope, because this is where we start getting into some really cool stuff here. Okay. So service domain and browser activities. What I'm basically saying here with these two settings is, look, if you're trying to share information, number one, you can only share that information to explicitly the domains, the service domains that we're allowing, right? And if you saw previously, I'm actually allowing mail@gmail.com as well as M365. I don't think you would do the same thing, but it's just for way of example. Okay, so I'm going to allow that. Okay, but I'm not going to allow it to go to Facebook. Okay, and I've chosen of the three options here: audit, block with override, block with override. Now, thing to keep in mind: block with override won't work if I'm trying it with a browser that's either unsupported and doesn't have the Purview extension added to it, or is blocked. But I'm also saying by this policy, even if it's allowed, it's not allowed with an unapproved browser. You have to use only the browsers that we have approved, and you're going to see this, okay? In addition, I'm actually blocking activities, right? I am preventing printing. I'm preventing copy and paste. I'm preventing copy down to USB. Okay. Now, in this instance as well, I've got it specifically set for purposes of demonstration to block with override. You may not. You may, again, using that example I used before, you may have it audit only, because maybe you don't really want to block it, but maybe a specific piece of information, you want a detailed record and an alert every time that's printed, especially if it's printed at home, for example. Okay. You can also do file activities. Now, I don't have any restricted apps in this case, but you can say it can only be accessed by this particular app. Same idea on the user notifications, right? We're giving user notifications. I've actually created two slightly different user notifications just for demonstration purposes. And again, you can allow overrides. Now, the overrides here are per action when it comes to the devices. But again, because we've got those other locations, Teams, OneDrive, SharePoint, Exchange, kind of highlighted there as one of the locations. We also have the M365 services where we can allow users to also override and provide justification. Okay. And again, here's that justification specifically for M365 services that I just spoke about. This is where you can allow that override and provide justification. For the endpoint policies or anywhere else, so if it was like an on-prem repository or whatnot, this is where you can actually set and require that justification. And then the same stuff as we talked about before, the instant reports, the priority, all that kind of fun stuff. Okay. Again, policy mode's going to be the same. I'm just going to leave it on. All right, so let's see what this actually looks like in action. Okay, and I'm going to have to go quickly with this, guys, because we are running out of time. Okay, so let's go with the first example. Let's say I am going to try to upload something to this particular service domain, right? I'm going to take that, in this case, I'm going to take its financial data that I'm looking for. So I'm just going to grab one of these financial information, and I go ahead and click open it. Okay, and instantly I'm blocked. I am prevented from taking this action. But because I've allowed overrides, I can choose a business justification. And by the way, I didn't go over this, but you can change what this justification option says. You can even allow it open to free text if you want. Great way for improving your policies. Okay. And I can go ahead, I can choose one of those and I can say allow, and that's going to allow it to go up. I'm not going to do that in this particular case, but it's certainly something that you could do. Okay. So that's part one. Service domain that's not allowed, but allowing a justification. Versus, and I'm going to go over to the Gmail here for a second, do a quick compose, and I'm going to take that same piece of information, okay, and I'm going to try to go ahead and upload it. Now, I've allowed gmail.com, right? That was specifically in my allowed service domains, so I can attach it no problem. If I flip over to an unapproved browser, however, and I try to do the same thing, which I'll do just like that, I am blocked. Full on stopped. Can't go further. Okay. And again, because I'm using an unapproved browser that does not have the Purview extension built in, I cannot override this. Now, if I have the Purview extension in, okay, and this is an allowed domain, it's going to be allowed to go through because Purview, the extension, is going to control that. And if it's to that unallowed service domain that we saw previously in Edge, I can override and provide a business justification. Okay. All right, let's take a look at some of the other things that we can do. Okay. Just dismiss this. I'm just going to hit Control P here to print, and I'm going to try to print to PDF. And I'll just call it whatever I want. This should have been one of the ones, unless I monkeyed with the policy. There we go, blocked. Can't print it. Okay, but again, can provide, because I had that override, I can provide a justification, and I can force it to allow it to happen. Okay, same with copy and paste. If I select this and I copy it here, and I try to paste it into, assuming that I've got the policy set up correctly, I'm going to go ahead and try to paste it, and again, I'm blocked. This would be true for USB. If I try to copy it down, uploading to a file share. So what Purview has done, and this is relatively new, within the last 7 or 8 months, right? We've taken it from, hey, we can control DLP within, SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams, and prevent like email leakage, and this just puts it on steroids. I can cover off now any scenario. I want to protect against Facebook leakage? Absolutely. I want to stop people from copying and pasting? Absolutely. I want to make sure my business users can still do their jobs and not get in the way and thus have to draft my own resume? Yes, I can do that. Very powerful. Okay, we are running out of time, so I am going to switch again. Well, I'm going to go away from tuning here. We'll have to do another webinar to cover specifically tuning, and maybe we can add a couple more things in there. You guys let us know what you want to see, and we'll try to wrap that into the next webinar. Okay? Now, after this, I know this seems like a lot, guys. Purview is a very powerful tool, okay? And not just in DLP, okay? And we are here to help. So how can we help? Well, a couple of things we can do right off the bat specifically for Purview DLP. There are funded engagements from Microsoft where we will come in and help set this up for you so that you can play around with it. Right? And we'll go through a workshop. It's about a 2 to 4 week workshop where we'll work through you and help kind of answer some of these questions specifically around Purview and get you some hands-on experience. We also have a DLP rapid deployment. It's designed to get you up and running in a matter of days. Now, it's not going to do your program for you, right? This is kind of that, I want to get up and running. I want to get a couple policies so I can start to play with this and see what this is like, right? So that's what it's designed for. But we also do full deployment services, and not just for DLP, but information protection, records management, data lifecycle, everything to do with Purview. We can certainly help. Last but not least, maybe you're starting this journey and you haven't even conceived of a DLP program yet. Well, that's our risk advisory services, which is really our consultant arm of security services, can help you put together that DLP program, can help you put together an overall security program. If you need, heck, we can even parachute in a virtual CISO if you need somebody to take ownership of this. Last but not least, guys, we offer a full set of Microsoft security services. We have other funded engagements from Microsoft that cover off Defender and Sentinel. We can even do a custom engagement, maybe to pilot something that has nothing to do with these three. Maybe it's on insider risk management, for example. We also have a series of rapid deployments, so not just Purview DLP, but we also do have one for Entra, for Defender XDR, and for Sentinel. And we can do full custom deployments, so it's a full set of deployment services. Just highlighted, there are a few that we will that we can do, but pretty much anything that you need, we can assist you with. And last but not least, we also offer managed security services with Managed Sentinel and MDR with Defender for Endpoint. Okay, that is all I have today. We have 3 minutes. I'm going to open the floor. Hopefully there's been some questions in the chat. Renee, maybe you can just pick one or two. And if we don't actually get to your question today, we'll put up sort of like a draft, send it out to everybody with answers to the questions that have been put in the chat there. And we may even just answer them in the next webinar. So Renee, do you want to go ahead there?
Yes, I do believe that there was a couple answered. I do see here one from Brian. Is there any Mac OS support for endpoints?
Yes. Mostly fully supported with a couple of caveats there. Mac endpoints are fully supported for DLP, as are servers, which is very cool. It's really well documented, so you have to give Microsoft some props here in terms of their level of documentation. What I will do is I will pull out the specific page that covers off what's supported and what not. It's pretty much universal support with a few minor caveats in there. But yeah, most settings and features for endpoint DLP are absolutely supported on Mac OS. Do we have another one there, Renee?
Yes, I do also see Miriam is taking the questions as well. So, but I do see one here from Drew. Can you set it such that the justification for breaking the policy is inputting user credentials as well?
You know what? I don't know an answer to that question. Off the top of my head, I don't think so. None of my testing and playing around has revealed that you can do that. That being said, I would expect if that's not possible, it would be something very soon because identity is kind of king. It doesn't look like it, though, at the outset, but I will get an answer for you on that. There might be something that you can configure specifically with conditional access and the app protection policies that would allow that to happen. I just don't know the answer off the top of my head, but I will get an answer for you.
Okay, and lastly, there was a 3-parter, but I'm just gonna pick one. If we check the option override the rule, if reported false positive, how anyone is reporting the email? Sorry, that was a little worded interestingly. But yeah, basically, I guess if the option to override is selected, is anyone reporting the email? I guess.
Yes. So when you report, and we didn't get a chance to show this, so again, we'll put this on the list of things to show in the next webinar. You know, what do you do when you've got an alert? Those instant reports, and whether or not you generate an instant, which you would see in there is that, yes, those will absolutely be reported in terms of the action being taken, not necessarily the policy being, if it's just automatically allowed rather than override, the action will be audited, but the policy won't generate an alert. But if you've overridden, that constitutes a policy hit. And so, yes, that will be recorded in an alert, as well as that business justification is going to go back. And that's kind of that feedback loop that we talked about. Okay. Now there is an option which we didn't go over where specifically with Microsoft 365 services, you can check a box that says, hey, if the user has just clicked the button that says this is a false positive and automatically override when they click that. If the question is, if you check that, do you still get an instant report? The answer is yes, because you are still hitting a policy. And so you're still getting that alert generated. Excuse me.
But sorry, David, who's reporting it though? Like, is it the end user or the admins reporting it?
This would be the end user. If the end user had flagged within the email itself, this is just a false positive. There's an option that comes up. You can just click that rather than a justification. And it's actually usually in the email flow, often it'll flow through and you'll get an email back saying, hey, we blocked this, and you just click false positive and away it goes. So it's user driven in that particular case. Now, if it's an admin identifying that's a false positive, well, the admin already has access to the alert and they're going to know to go and tune that policy, and they'll have to go back through that planning process. And remember, one of those key caveats I called out, how were you going to tune policies and mitigate false positives? So you're going to have a process there that you're going to want to follow. All right, guys, unfortunately, we are at time. We're actually 1 minute over. I want to thank everybody for being here today. Again, please let us know your feedback on this webinar. We will do a second series, and maybe a couple of months from now, because we do have a couple other webinars coming up specifically on threat hunting with Sentinel and Defender. That's actually our next 2 webinars that we'll be hosting in security, but we will do a follow-up webinar on this. So please let us know if there's stuff specifically that you would like to see, maybe us reviewing some settings or some unique situations, and we'll see what we can craft for you. And then let us know the feedback in terms of how you enjoyed this webinar, if it hit the mark, if it didn't, and what we can do to improve to give you more of the information you guys need to be successful. All right. Thank you, everybody, for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day.